Hello friends, in the series which we are doing in issues in world history 20th century, we will talk about the Russian Revolution today. As all of us are aware that Russian Revolution was one of the important events in the world history. It was a momentous kind of a development which took place, and how the ideas of capitalism and ideas of communism and socialism, they have been at variance with each other. And Russian Revolution also took place when the First World War was continuing. The First World War began in 1914 and then how it ended in 1918. And during that particular period, we find that how Russia withdrew itself from the war, and this kind of a situation where we find that the Russian Revolution took place. And scholars, they have tried to see how this kind of a revolution, which was of the first kind in the world, took place in Russia, and how the people, those who were in Russia, the working classes, they were not ready to in a way tolerate their dehumanized situation, and how the czars, for that matter, they were playing with their lives when they were there in terms of the exploitation which entailed on them. And when you talk about the miseries of the people of Russia and how they rose in a rebellion in that sense, where they were not ready to in a way continue with their kind of a current situation, and how they were also being politically organized and therefore were able to overthrow the old social and the political order. And so we find that the existing situation in Russia was such, and because of the existing situation, how the proletariat rose against the autocratic rulers of those times. And if we see the earlier situation as well, if we see the decades preceding 1917, the Russian society was undergoing great changes at that point of time, and that resulted in a crisis for the old order. And the new order, in the framework of the social and economic forces created by these changes had different interests and aspirations. So they wanted to bring about a lot of changes in the Russian society, and of the earlier period, where we find that this kind of an exploitation was there through the autocratic rule, was to be replaced by a new social as well as the economic order. And we find that when you talk about the 1917, we find that some kind of an intense contradiction and polarization between the old and new in Russia could be seen at that time, and how this kind of a movement which happened in Russia, it talked about the democratic aspirations of these new forces. And when you talk about the Russian state, it in a way represented the interests of the old ruling classes, and we see that in Russia right up to 1917 there existed an autocratic form of government. So when you talk about the political situation of Russia and how the people in Russia, they were in a way being exploited by the government of that time, and the government was autocratic in nature. So we realize that how people, they rose in arms against them. They were not ready to tolerate such kind of a dehumanization which was inimical to their interests. And when you talk about the institutions in Russia, there were no representative institutions and no right to form the political organizations. That political organizations could not be formed at that point of time. And when you talk about the censorship, then we realize that there was a lot of censorship in Russia, and arbitrary arrests they could be made, and any kind of a freedom with regard to expressing one's opinion, it was not there in Russia. And how people, when they were arrested without any reason, so how they would be treated in the jails was another matter. And when you talk about any kind of a religious toleration, it did not exist in Russia at that point of time, and a kind of oppression which was there of all the nationalities other than the Russian. So we find that Russian society was quite an autocratic society, and the leaders and the rulers, they behaved with the masses in such a fashion that the masses were not even human beings. So, such kind of a situation was not tolerable to the people, where they did not have any kind of basic rights, and how their freedom was censored, because in that sense the censorship policy was very strict in nature. It was also very arbitrary in nature. And when you talk about Russia or the Russian Empire, it was a multinational empire that used its strength against all democratic movements in Europe, and it was also known as the policeman of Europe as well. So, we find that how the autocracy which was functioning in Russia, it was very strong, and it was working on the support of the landed aristocracy and the bourgeois of that period. And we see that this kind of an autocracy, it guaranteed to these classes their privileged position in the Russian society. So, how these people, those who were providing support to the upper section of the society, how these people were not only corrupt, autocratic in nature, exploitative, and they did not have any kind of values which could be seen as human values, because the way they treated the other classes and even other nationalities apart from the Russians. So, we find that by 1917, not only a conflict between the old social forces and new, but also between these new social forces and the Russian state also took place. And when you talk about the revolutionary movement there, then how it wanted to, in a way, it sought to overthrow the Russian autocracy, and Russian autocracy was also behaving in that fashion which was not to the liking of the people of Russia. And when you talk about their situation, whether the agricultural sector or the industries, we find that it was not a very pleasant kind of a situation when you compare it with the other European countries of those times, and how the agrarian situation and the peasantry, though some kind of emancipation of serf or the serfdom had taken place in Russia, but we find that despite the emancipation of the serfs, the peasantry were one of the most exploited lot, and the way they were being exploited by the upper sections of the society. And we see that the people, those who were at the top of the society, they were in a way were trying to dominate the other sections of the society, those who were below them. And despite the fact that peasantry had become free, we find that the way peasants, they had to pay for their freedom, and they had to pay so heavily that they remain continually in debt and forced to work for the landed aristocracy very cheaply. So, we find that this kind of an emancipation of serf, though it was there, but despite that, we find that how peasants, they had to buy their freedom, and how the kind of money or the amount of money which they had to pay was also enormous, and how they were into debt because of this, and they forced to work for the landed aristocracy very cheaply, because they did not have this kind of an option where they could get some kind of work at other places. And so, we find that peasantry was also very heavily burdened by the taxes to the state. The kind of money which was being asked in terms of taxes was also very heavy, and the kind of money which they were paying in the taxes also in a way deteriorated their situation as well. And because of such kind of a situation where they were being treated very badly, the kind of taxes which were very heavy which were being paid by them, we find that the peasantry was not satisfied, and it was very discontented in nature. And we see that there was, when you talk about the earlier part of the 20th century, then some kind of an increase in the military could be seen, and a number of peasant uprisings as well. And when you talk about the economic situation or the economy of Russia, we talk about how the agriculture it continued to remain backward, as the peasants they had nothing to invest in the betterment of his land. So, we find that not much development in agriculture could took place in Russia, and how Russian society was such that the people those who were there in the agricultural sector, they did not have money to invest in agricultural sector. And we also find that the landed aristocracy, they were also not feeling motivated to introduce the new technology because they had ready labor in the poor peasantry. They did not want to invest money in terms of technology, because when they are going to invest in technology, then less labor would be required, and they had cheap labor at their disposal in that sense. So, they also did not want to invest money in the land. And when you talk about the economy, then we find that definitely agriculture was a major sector of the Russian economy, and how the peasantry it constituted the majority of its population. And the agrarian and the peasant problems, they became an important factor for the revolution in Russia. And we also find that how peasantry it formed an important component of the revolutionary movement, how the proletariat constituted of the peasantry and the working classes, and how the role of the proletariat was an important factor in the Russian revolution. And when you talk about the kind of industrialization in Russia, was a delayed kind of industrialization in Russia, and how the workers, those who were working in the factories, we find them, they were also very disenchanted, and because of which we find some kind of a working class movement which was comparatively more militant and political than in other countries. So, we find that the disenchantment was not only restricted to the agricultural sector, but this kind of disenchantment was there in the industries as well, where workers they were not happy with their situation. And we find that when you talk about the workers at that point of time, they had a lot of grievances, and some kind of a common struggle could also be seen, because the agrarian setup as well as the industries in both the sectors, how these people they were being exploited, and so they had their common interest in terms of getting rid of this kind of a rule which was exploiting them, which was misusing their services. And we find that how state played an important role in the industrialization process as well, with the result that the Russian bourgeois was not as strong and developed as in other countries of Western Europe, where bourgeois played an important role in the industrialization process. So, we also see that how in Russian industrialization the role of state was also there, and the position of the bourgeoisie in Russia was not as strong as when you compare it with the other countries, especially Britain and France. So, where we find that the state did not play that kind of a role as was being played by the bourgeois section. And we also see that how this Russian bourgeois, they had strong links with the autocracy as well, and so they had this kind of a connection with them as well, which was not conducive for the interests of the agrarian sector or the people those who were working in the agricultural sector as well as the working classes. And we find that the Russian working class movement was in turn both against the autocracy and the Russian bourgeois, that is the capitalists. So, we find that how the working class, they came out of their own zones against the autocratic sections as well as the bourgeois, the capitalists, those who were exploiting them. So, when you talk about Russian empire, we talked about how it was a multinational empire, and the way ruling dynasty had emerged around the Russian part of empire, and they followed a policy called Russification, where we find that the suppression of the languages and the literatures and cultures of other nationalities was being done, and those areas were now exploited economically also. So, we find that how when some kind of a dynasty which was ruling Russia at that point of time. Also we find that other cultures and languages and literatures, they were not being promoted, rather they were being suppressed, and they were also trying to exploit these areas as well. So we find that how this kind of a relationship which was there, it was in a way almost colonial in nature, with these areas being used simply as source of raw material for the development of industries in Russia proper. And nationalities such as Caucasians and Kazakhs and Kyrgyz and Polish, etc., they were not happy, and they played an important role in the revolutionary movement for overthrowing the existing social and political system. So we find that this kind of a relationship which Russia had with the other nationalities, and how these nationalities they were being exploited by the Russians, and how they shared a relationship which could be called as some sort of a colonial relationship, because of the fact that how they were using these areas in terms of securing the raw materials from them. And when we talk about the political groups, leadership for example, we find that no revolutionary movement can be successful unless it is guided by a correct understanding of the existing situation and a correct program and something to offer to the people. And in Russian Revolution we find that the many political groups, they were active at that point of time. They were playing an important role in raising the consciousness of the people, particularly of the workers and the peasants, through the political education, political propaganda and agitation as well. So we find that how various sections of the society, especially the peasants as well as the workers, they were active in the Russian Revolution, and how various political groups for that matter, they were trying to connect with the masses, the agriculturalists as well as the workers, and how they were being in a way educated about the situation in Russia. And this was done through some kind of a political education, through agitation as well. They were being made aware about the kind of situation in which Russia was at that point of time, and their own disenchantment and their own working condition was also being communicated to them. They were being made aware that what they can do to bring about that kind of a change in their own lives. And we find that a number of organizations by the peasants and the workers, they were being established, so that some kind of a cohesiveness and a direction to the revolutionary movement could be given. And when you talk about the important political tendencies, they were of the populists in the 19th century, and the socialist revolutionaries, and the liberals and the social democrats who were the Marxists, particularly Bolsheviks. So all these kinds of groups, those who were there in the Russian society at that point of time, how they were also being made aware about that particular situation. And when you talk about the leaders of the Russian Revolution, especially Lenin, who was the most important leader of the Bolshevik party and of the Russian Revolution as well, Trotsky, Bukharin and Stalin were the other leaders. And we see that the revolution, it happened in different stages, and when you talk about the revolutionary movement in Russia, it emerged in the 19th century, and initially it consisted of only members of the middle class intelligentsia. As workers and the peasants, they became increasingly discontented and also aware of their oppressed situation, they also began to struggle against the Russian autocracy. So we find that this kind of movement, which could be seen as a revolutionary movement, it started in the 19th century, and how it ended in 1917 with the Russian Revolution, where we find that they were able to realize their objectives. And we find that in the earlier part of the 20th century, the Russian revolutionary movement was a mass based movement in which workers and the peasants, they were playing a crucial and a decisive role. And When you talk about the first major assault on the Russian autocracy, it took place in 1905, which is known as the 1905 revolution, and also a dress rehearsal for the 1917 revolution. And we find that how workers as well as the peasants, they began to demand a democratic republic. They were no longer satisfied with the situation in Russia, and they wanted some kind of a democracy for themselves. And we find that how the workers, they got themselves engaged in strikes, and how army was also dissatisfied, it also revolted. And the first Soviets, they came into being during the 1905 revolution, and it was a revolutionary organization of the working people. And this revolution did not succeed in overthrowing the autocracy, but the experience gained by workers and the peasants during this revolution was extremely valuable for them. So, we find that the 1905 revolution was not a successful kind of revolution, but how people, those who were associated with this revolution, they gained some kind of an experience when they joined this revolution. And we find till 1911 there were years of great repression, when many of the revolutionaries, those who were associated with the 1905 revolution, they were being arrested, and the workers organizations, they were also being destroyed. And when you talk about the First World War, which began in 1914, and it also had some kind of adverse effect on the Russian economy and the lives of the Russian people, and it led to a greater politicization of people as well as the alignment of political forces which were opposed to autocracy. So, we find that 1914 First World War, it also in a way impacted the Russian economy, and how the people of Russia, they got impacted during that time, and people, they also were politicized at this point of time, where we find that they were aware about what all was happening in the framework of the Russian economy, society and polity. And how we also find that the political forces which were opposed to autocracy, they also got aligned at this point of time. And when you talk about the causes of the February Revolution, we find that it was because of the shortage of the bread in Petrograd, and after a few days this kind of demand was raised that down with autocracy, and there were red flags all over the city, and how it spread to other cities and to the countryside. And we find that how army had to be deployed in a way, and when army came on the side of the revolution, the people, those who were in a way engaged in revolution, army came to their side as well. So, we find that Russian economy of that particular period was also in tatters because of the exploitation which was being done at that point of time. And we find that this kind of autocratic behavior of the Tsars was responsible for that kind of a situation, and people, they were not happy in that sense that they were being exploited, the taxes were very heavy, and the way they were being treated by the autocracy was also very questionable. And in this particular kind of a situation, we find that the agriculturalists as well as the workers, both of them, they were at the receiving end. And because of this kind of a situation, both of them, they wanted that the autocracy should go. And this kind of an exploitation continues till 1917, as we have seen. And when we find that this kind of a situation offered any kind of an opportunity which was being offered to them, especially after 1914 when the war started, and how we find that the autocratic elements in the Russian polity, they were trying to even exploit that situation as well. And some of the leaders, those who were instrumental, especially Lenin and Trotsky, both of them, they played an important role during that time, not only in terms of providing some kind of a critique to the kind of activities in which the autocracy involved itself, But at the same time we find that the kind of mobilization which was required at that point of time, how the masses, they were to be made aware about the kind of situation in which they were, and how they had to come out of that situation by rising against the autocracy and to come in the favor of the revolution. Definitely they played an important role in that sense. And when you see that even shortage of bread, which was one of the basic needs of the people in terms of feeding them, was also not available. And this kind of a situation definitely in a way played an important role in terms for the cause of the Russian Revolution. And when you talk about the kind of an idea which was there in that sense in the framework of the Russian Revolution, we find that since 19th century such kind of a situation was there in Russia. People, they were not happy, and the beginning of the 20th century provided them this kind of an opportunity where they could get rid of the autocratic elements which were there in the Russian society, which were feeding off themselves, and they were not giving them any kind of freedom. They were not providing them any kind of a leisure. They were also not even providing them any kind of benefit which were due to them. So this kind of a situation definitely was a kind of a dampener for them, and against which they rose in rebellion. The rest we will talk about the Russian Revolution in our next lecture. Thank you very much.